Located right next to the beach, surrounded by countryside, a short distance away from larger towns and cities, with good rail links and even nearby ferries to France, Tide Mills is the type of village estate agents would say you'd have to see to believe. Except there's nothing to see anymore, because it's been abandoned. Today I'm in East Sussex, between the towns of Newhaven and Seaford, near the village of Bishopstone, and if you turn off the main road and cross this railway line, then you'll come across the remains of the lost village of Tide Mills. This land was originally owned by Thomas Pelham, who was Britain's Prime Minister between 1754 and 1756, and then again 7 months later from 1757 until 1762. Pelham might not be the most well-known former British Prime Minister, but his influence can still be felt in politics today. According to his Wikipedia page, he's generally seen as a muddle-headed buffoon who struggled to understand the business of government. He was so much of a joke that he was buried in a village called Laughton, or at least a village that's spelt like it would be pronounced Laughton. But as Thomas Pelham approached the later years of his premiership, like many prime ministers, he wanted to build something. Some prime ministers build pools, some build tree houses, some build mini-budgets that tank the economy, but Thomas Pelham wanted to build a mill. It's perhaps a bit more accurate to say Thomas Pelham allowed corn merchants to build a mill. It was his land, and so he gave permission for the construction. It was a tide mill, which is where at high tide water runs through this thing called a sluice and is trapped in a kind of pond. Then at low tide the pond empties and the water goes back out through the sluice, turning a wheel. Construction on the mill began in 1761. I don't know when it was finished because various sources give different dates, but it was probably somewhere between 1768 and 1788. The point is that Thomas Pelham died before it was completed. After Pelham's death, the mill was sold and changed hands a few times, until it was taken over by a local businessman called William Catt, who was a human in the early 1800s. Under his leadership, the mill expanded and became hugely successful. He turned the surrounding land into a village with cottages for the workers. There were also shops and a school. It was all very similar to the city of Pripyat, which was created many years later to serve the Chernobyl power plant. Except there was no nuclear meltdown here. The only thing toxic was the water, because raw sewage was dumped straight into the sea, a tradition that's proudly kept alive by Thames Water.
People who walk down there today, Chris, merely see the remains of a few houses, a few flint walls and so on. I doubt if many of them fully realise that here was not just a village, but a vast industrial complex, because here was a tidally operated mill.
Hence the name.
A granary with a windmill on top, a blacksmith shop, a slipway for shipping, etc. It used the windmill for the hoisting of sacks of corn up into the granary and the lowering of flour down into barges, and the barges in fact actually pass beneath the granary. It's an astonishing engineering feat.
Despite being a small village, Tide Mills was somewhat like Emmerdale or Weatherfield in that something dramatic always seemed to be happening here. There were a load of shipwrecks, and in April 1795, soldiers stationed at a nearby military barracks who were angry about their meagre rations marched on Seaford and stole a load of food. They were then so hangry that they came to Tide Mills and stole more than 200 sacks of flour. The mutiny was quickly quashed and some of the troops were court-martialed. 2 men, who were seen as the main ringleaders, were forced to kneel on top of their coffins as they were executed by some of their fellow mutineers. 6 men were sentenced to flogging and 1 man was sent to Australia. It's not hard to see who got the better end of the deal there. As punishment, the Royal Oxford Militia was stripped of its royal title, so watch out, Tunbridge Wells, that can happen. The whole thing was very dramatic and sounds like it could be turned into a film, but there's already a 3-hour musical about a guy stealing bread. After William Catt's death in 1853, things started to go downhill for Tide Mills. In 1864, a railway station was built right next to the village. It doesn't exist anymore, but you can still see what's left of the platform. The station meant it was easier and cheaper for residents to travel outside of Tide Mills, because in those days travelling by train was actually affordable, and why wouldn't you want to leave? There was no running water, electricity or toilets, and rubbish was disposed of by throwing it into a big ditch and then burning it. The mill was almost as bad as Willy Wonka's factory in terms of occupational health risks. But the extension of the railway also allowed farmers to send their grain to mills that were further afield. This marked the beginning of the decline of Tide Mills. The situation wasn't helped by a big storm and flood in 1875, which caused serious damage to the mill. In 1883, the mill's machinery was sold off. In 1890, the mill was converted into a warehouse, and by 1901, it had been demolished altogether. With the mill gone, there wasn't much reason to stay in the village, but some people did, although they had to find other jobs nearby. In 1904, a Marconi radio station was set up on the beach at Tide Mills. Its purpose was to help guide ships across the channel, but 4 years later, in yet another classic Tide Mills moment worthy of a soap opera, the station's huge mast was struck by lightning, killing the operator. In 1917, during the First World War, a seaplane base was constructed at Tide Mills. The planes could escort ships transporting ammunition and other supplies from Newhaven to France, keeping an eye out for German U-boats. Each plane was small and made mostly from wood, but carried 2 pilots, 3 bombs, a machine gun and 2 homing pigeons. Planes were only a new invention at the time, and so there were a number of crashes. 2 officers were killed when their seaplane crashed at Newhaven shortly after taking off from Tide Mills. Another died when his plane crashed into the sluice gates. The seaplane station livened up Tide Mills a bit because many officers lived there and had a mess in the village where they would drink and party. But by 1919, after the war was over, the station was closed and the soldiers left the village. That still wasn't the end for Tide Mills though, because a hospital was built here in 1924. The ruins are still visible next to the beach. It was called the Chailey Heritage Marine Hospital as part of the nearby Chailey Heritage School. The hospital was founded by the Guild of the Brave Poor Things, which wins the award for most patronising charity name ever, and it offered medical care to disabled boys. It was also deliberately built right on the beach because it was thought that the fresh air could help people heal after operations, and indeed many patients were left in beds outside. While they were being treated at the hospital, the children also got to partake in activities including sports, model building, and whatever this is, but the patients weren't allowed to mix with the other children from the village. The hospital was relocated in 1939 as the Second World War kicked off, but this stretch of beach wasn't just used to treat disabled children, but also horses. In 1922, William Catt's old coal yard was taken over by the former jockey David Dale, who built stables where he would treat injured racehorses. He was known as the Miracle Man. His sons Leonard and David were known as Sid and Dickie, respectively, and his daughter Dorothy was known as Dinky. His wife Annie was known as Annie. They lived in a caravan and were the only household in Tide Mills to have running water and a flushing toilet. But they later became one of the many families to be forcibly evicted from the village. It was declared unfit for habitation in 1937, but some people remained until 1940 when it was taken over by the military. They were worried that the area could see an influx of Germans, but that never happened because there were no sunbeds on the beach at Tide Mills. The last resident left in the village when the military arrived was Stan Tubb.
We were turned out at 1 hour's notice. The military took over there and made it a prohibited area because they thought it was a likely landing place for the Germans. And actually I remained there. I was the only one remained in the village. I worked on the sea defence and harbour for 50 years, and the military let me remain there to advise them on the sea conditions.
Right.
In the event of invasion, they also warned me that the village was the guns was ranged on the village, and of course I knew the risk.
After the war ended and the military left Tide Mills, it was reclaimed by nature, and there are still no toilets here.